This is the full story of British colonialism in Nigeria, from the bombardment of Lagos in 1851 to independence on October 1, 1960. The British Empire ruled colonial Nigeria from the mid-19th century until 1960, when the country gained its independence. Alongside other European powers, Britain had settlements and forts in West Africa in the 1700s, but had yet to establish plantation colonies just like what was in existence in the Americas. In 1807, the British Parliament enacted the Slave Trade Act, which prohibited British subjects from participating in the slave trade. This was after over 150 years of rampant trading of slaves by the British and Portuguese, centered on West Central Africa, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Bight of Benin, which was also known as the Slave Coast, with Ouidah and Lagos being the major ports. Also, Akwa Akpa, Bonny, and New Calabar were the major ports in the Bight of Biafra. However, with the enactment of the Slave Trade Act, the British made anti-slavery treaties with powers in West Africa by using the military to enforce it, and lobbied other European powers to stop the trade. All of these provided the opportunity for preliminary surveys and research of the region. The economy of the Benin Kingdom, which had until then benefited greatly from the slave trade, saw a decline and ultimately led to its collapse. Slavery reduced the region's otherwise boisterous and rich population, leading to chaos and confusion, which in turn paved the way for more aggressive colonization by the British. Although Christian missionaries had been influential in the abolition of the slave trade, their impact was not felt until the 1840s. The Church of England's Church Missionary Society (CMS) was the first mission opened and operated in areas between Lagos and Ibadan, while the Roman Catholic religious leaders established missions in the 1860s, with the latter being popular among the Igbos, while the former was mostly embraced by the Yorubas. The CMS appointed Samuel Ajayi Crowther as the first Anglican bishop of the Niger, and is credited for translating the English Bible into the Yoruba language. Nigerians, especially in the south, gradually accepted Christianity as the various denominations adapted to local conditions and selected African clerics for the missions. In the long run, these European missionaries effectively reinforced colonial policy in terms of promoting education, health and welfare schemes, and were in control all through the latter part of the 19th century. On the bright side, they saw an end to inhumane traditional practices such as human sacrifice, infanticide, obnoxious rituals, and so on. The Prime Minister of Britain in the mid-19th century, Lord Henry John Temple, abhorred slavery. Therefore, he took advantage of the presence of Christian missionaries and divisions in native politics to encourage the end of the slave trade. In line with an agreement with the deposed Oba of Lagos, Oba Akitoye, to help him regain his throne from his nephew, Oba Kosoko, who was a leading slave trader, and abolish the slave trade, The Royal Navy on December 26, 1851, with a flotilla of boats, mounted an attack on the Oba of Lagos's palace. Kosoko put up a strong defense, but by the second day, the battle, known locally as Ogun Agidingbi, was won. This event is known as the Bombardment of Lagos. Consequently, Oba Akintoye was reinstalled as the Oba of Lagos, and on January 1, 1852, he signed the treaty between Great Britain and Lagos, thereby abolishing the slave trade. Having the British consular authority over Lagos led to a rapid increase in trade with the interior in terms of palm oil exports from Lagos and cotton production in Abeokuta. Despite this, the political situation in the interior had worsened. The British were determined to put an end to the slave trade fueled by the Yoruba civil wars, and this led to the annexation of Lagos in 1861. Oba Akintoye's son, Oba Dosunmu, who was now the Oba of Lagos, signed a treaty known as the Lagos Treaty of Cession on August 6, 1861 with the British Empire. Thus, Lagos was ceded to Britain and became a British Crown colony. The colony's administrator, Captain John Glover, formed a militia of majority Hausa troops, and this became the Lagos Constabulary, later culminating into the Nigerian Army and the Nigeria Police Force. These soldiers were known as Glover's Hausas. After the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, the British announced the formation of the Oil Rivers Protectorate to control and develop trade coming down the Niger River. The protectorate included the Niger Delta and extended eastward to Calabar. The territory was renamed the Niger Coast Protectorate in 1894 and in 1906 was expanded to include the Lagos Colony and northward up the Niger River. In the 1870s, a British merchant, George Tubman Goldie, merged trading companies located along the Niger River into the United African Company, which was soon renamed the National African Company and finally the Royal Niger Company. He did this to bring an end to the fierce competition engaged in by different companies who sometimes used force to get suppliers to go into contract with them and meet their demands. The Royal Niger Company had its headquarters located at the major trading port of the company, which was far inland Lokoja. From there, it took on the responsibility of overseeing the depots along the Niger and Benue rivers. Sokoto, Gwandu, and Nupe had negotiated treaties with the Royal Niger Company, which was seen as giving the company exclusive access to trade as annual tribute was paid in return. The treaties gave the Royal Niger Company total power to settle whatever disputes arose at the ports, to farm, mine, and build on their territory, to protect the kings and chiefs from attacks, and restricted them from interfering with the native laws and customs of the land. As a result, the Royal Niger Company was able to deprive France and Germany of access to the region under Goldie's command. He was seen as the founding father of Nigeria, as he was the one who laid the basis for the British claims to the country. Ultimately, the Royal Niger Company became the sole government of the region, although the company allowed the local kings to act as partners in governance and trade. It employed local native workers who were paid in barter. Top earners received 4 bags of salt per month. Barter and credit were the mechanisms of trade. The major imports of the Royal Niger Company included gin and low-quality firearms. The Royal Niger Company also had its armed forces, including a river fleet, which were used to attack uncooperative villages. As expected, Joseph Chamberlain's appointment as colonial secretary in 1895 brought about a rise in the territorial ambitions of the British Empire. British colonial rule was being solicited for by local colonial administrators as they believed that trading and taxation done in British pounds would be more lucrative than trade by barter. To enlarge its sphere of influence, the British led a series of military campaigns and expanded its commercial opportunities. Hausa soldiers were recruited to fight, and because the British had superior weapons, tactics, and political unity, victory was certain. In 1892, the British forces overran the Ijebu kingdom with the Maxim gun. Ijebu had kicked against missionaries and foreign traders, but British machine guns gave them a roller coaster victory as they swept through the rest of Yoruba land, conquering it, although the area had already been weakened by over 70 years of civil wars. By 1893, almost all of the other political entities in Yoruba land had signed diverse treaties with the British, joining them with the colony of Lagos. From 1896 to 1897, the forces of the Niger Coast Protectorate fought with the remnants of the Benin Kingdom, captured Benin City, and drove Ovoranwe Nogbaisi, the Oba of Benin, into exile. Conquering Igbo land was not a walk in the park for the British, as the Igbo people had no central political organization. The British launched the Anglo-Aro War of 1901-1902 under the guise of freeing the Igbos from the Aro Confederacy, which was a political union formed by the Aro people. Villages were conquered through the burning of crops and houses, but the Igbos remained difficult to subdue. Annual missions with the intent to pacify and convince the locals of British supremacy were carried out by British forces. Between 1897 and 1903, the British subdued the Muslim-dominated northern Nigeria with the invasion and capture of Ilorin, Bida, Yola, the Sokoto Caliphate, and the Kano Emirates. By 1897, the British had started their plans for the direct control of the area now known as Nigeria. They agreed that the colony of Lagos, the Niger Coast Protectorate, and the Royal Niger Company should be merged. That same year, the Royal West African Frontier Force was created by the British, having Colonel Frederick Lugard in charge. Lugard then recruited 2,600 troops comprising of both Hausa and Yoruba men, evenly split in 1 year. In 1898, the Niger Committee, chaired by the Earl of Selborne, put down guidelines for running the colony of Nigeria. The border between Nigeria and French West Africa was also finalized with the Anglo-French Convention of the same year. In 1900, the British government took control of the Southern and Northern Protectorates, which were governed by the Colonial Office in London. The Governor-General reported to the Colonial Office and managed his colony. As earlier stated, Plans to combine the three areas of jurisdiction, that is northern and southern Nigeria, and the colony of Lagos had been mulled over and thought to be the solution to reducing administrative expenses and facilitating the easy deployment of money and resources. In line with the order recommended by the Niger Committee, the colony of Lagos was merged with the Southern Protectorate of Nigeria by the Colonial Office on May 1, 1906. Lugard constantly advocated for the unification of the whole territory, and this task was achieved when Nigeria was amalgamated on January 1, 1914 with the merging of the Southern and Northern Protectorates of Nigeria. The newly united colony was overseen by a proconsul known as the Governor General of Nigeria, who happened to be Frederick Lugard. Nigeria was subdivided into northern, western, and eastern regions, and the Lieutenant Governor was placed in each region to provide independent government services. While Hausa was recognized as the official language in the north, English had official status in the south. Economic links were increased among the regions, but the indirect rule adopted by the British discouraged political interchange. Greater unity was not encouraged among the regions until after the end of the Second World War in 1945. Until the expiration of his tenure as Governor General in 1919, Lugard was focused on solidifying British sovereignty and assuring local administration through the traditional rulers. As a matter of fact, he spent 4 months of every year in London, and major decisions regarding the country were not carried out until his return. Lugard was scornful of the educated Africans who populated the south, especially Lagos, and recommended that the capital should be transferred from Lagos to Kaduna, but his request was rejected by the Colonial Office in London. They argued that such an exercise would be too expensive and unsafe. However, Lugard's immediate successor, Sir Hugh Clifford, was a polar opposite. An aristocrat professional administrator with liberal instincts who had earlier won recognition for his rulership of the Gold Coast, now Ghana. The new Governor General rejected Lugard's proposal to move the capital from Lagos to Kaduna, clamored for economic development, and encouraged enterprises by immigrant Southerners in the north while resisting European participation in capital-intensive activities. Clifford anticipated general liberation, heading to a more representative form of government and building elite schools modeled after European education. On the one hand, Lugard had wanted to apply lessons learned in the north to the south, but on the other hand, Clifford was ready to extend successful practices in the south to the north. However, the Lieutenant Governor in the north, Richmond Palmer, disagreed with Clifford and insisted on using Lugard's principles and further decentralization. First, grants were allocated to the Northern Nigerian Protectorate from the British Treasury each year, while the Southern Protectorate financed itself. However, after gaining political control of the country, the British introduced a system of taxation. This was done to encourage wage labor and put subsistence farming in the back seats. Sometimes, forced labor was used for public works projects. These policies were resisted. The British enforced the Native Revenue Amendment Ordinance in April 1927, and direct taxation on men was introduced in 1928 without any resistance. However, while carrying out a census relating to taxation in October 1929 in Loloko, the women in the area were suspicious that direct taxation would be imposed on them and protested. The protest is now known as the Women's War. They insisted on not paying taxes and not allowing the appraisal of their properties. Nationalism became a political issue in Nigeria as activists sought increased participation in the governmental process. The British tried to preserve the indigenous cultures of each area while introducing modern technology, politics, and social concepts. While the North accepted indirect rule, the South, especially the Igbos, opposed it. The Southerners' opposition was due to the educational exposure which they acquired abroad. These Southern nationalists were critical of colonialism and wanted self-government. Nigerians began to form different associations in the 1920s. They were centers for educated people to hone their leadership skills and form broad social networks. Organizations having ethnic and kinship undertones were also formed as tribal unions within the same area. City dwellers who are of the same ethnic groups came together to replicate the lifestyle in the rural areas they came from, where everyone looked out for one another. The 1922 Clifford Constitution gave Nigerians the opportunity to vote for several representatives to the Legislative Council, with the figurehead being Herbert Macaulay. He is usually referred to as the father of Nigerian nationalism. Macaulay awakened political interest through his newspaper, the Lagos Daily News. He also led Nigeria's first political party, the Nigerian National Democratic Party (NNDP), to many successful elections in Lagos. Herbert Macaulay called for development in terms of the economy, education, Africanization of the civil service, and self-government for Lagos. During this era, Awolowo founded the Action Group Party for the Yoruba people, while Ahmadu Bello founded the Northern People's Congress for the Northerners, and Nnamdi Azikiwe led the National Council for Nigerian Citizens (NCNC) for the Easterners. Aminu Kano, who had been instrumental in founding the Northern People's Congress, broke away in 1950 to form the Northern Elements Progressive Union. The political parties tussled for positions of power in readiness for the independence of Nigeria. From 1946 to 1954, 3 constitutions were enacted, which moved the country towards greater internal autonomy, even though each one generated political controversy. Political parties had an increasing role, and it all tilted towards the institution of a parliamentary system of government, having regional assemblies and the Federal House of Representatives. A new constitution, formulated by Sir Arthur Richards, who was the Governor-General at the time, was approved in 1946 by the British Parliament at Westminster and promulgated in Nigeria. The Arthur Richards Constitution reserved power in the hands of the Governor-General, but it also provided for an expanded Legislative Council empowered to deliberate on matters affecting the whole country. Houses of Assembly were established in each of the 3 regions to advise the Lieutenant Governors posted there. However, the Arthur Richards Constitution was suspended in 1950 due to calls for greater autonomy, and this led to an interparliamentary conference that same year at Ibadan. Here, the terms of a new constitution were drafted. It was called the Macpherson Constitution, named after the incumbent Governor-General, John Stuart Macpherson, and it went into effect in 1951. The Macpherson Constitution allowed renewed impetus to political activities and participation at the national level, and also boosted regionalism. Subsequent revisions done to the Light 13 Constitution of 1954 established the federal principle and facilitated independence. Under the parliamentary system, the western and eastern regions became self-governing in 1957, and the same was done by the northern region 2 years later in 1959. All the regions stuck to parliamentary forms and were equally autonomous to the federal government in Lagos, despite the numerous differences in detail among their regional systems. Real power was centered in the regions, even though at the federal level, specified powers including responsibility for banking, shipping and navigation, communication, currency and external affairs were retained. Most importantly, the regional governments were in charge of public expenditures obtained from revenues raised within their region. The major event that had a lasting impact on Nigeria's economic development was the discovery and exploitation of petroleum deposits. The once abandoned oil search was revived by Shell and British Petroleum in 1937. Intense exploration, which started in 1946, finally yielded results in 1956 when oil was discovered in commercial quantity at Oloibiri in the Niger Delta. The exportation of oil began at facilities constructed at Port Harcourt in 1958. The House of Representatives election after the adoption of the 1954 Constitution saw the MPC clinch a total of 79 seats with all members from the northern region. The National Council of Nigerian Citizens (NCNC) took 56 seats while the Action Group grabbed only 27 seats. The Governor's Executive Council was merged with the Council of Ministers in 1957 as a step further toward independence, and the All-Nigerian Federal Executive Council was formed. On August 30, 1957, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, who was the federal parliamentary leader of the MPC, was appointed Chief Minister of Nigeria. He formed a coalition government inclusive of the Action Group and the NCNC to prepare the country for the final British withdrawal. Nigeria became independent on October 1, 1960 with Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa as the Prime Minister. Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe later emerged as the Governor General representing the Queen, succeeding James Wilson Robertson 46 days later on November 16, 1960. The new Nigerian government was made up of the popularly elected 312-member House of Representatives and the 44-member Senate chosen by the regional legislatures. The regional constitutions followed the federal model in terms of functionality and structure. When Nigeria gained its independence, the prospects appeared promising and expectations for the future of the country were high. The country had so much going for her. It was the most populous country in Africa. Commercial quantities of petroleum had been discovered in the Niger Delta region in 1956, so the potential for economic growth was great, hence the title, Giants of Africa. Both the country's citizens and outsiders strongly believed that Nigeria would rise to lead Africa in world affairs. The new nation was perceived as a beacon of hope for other African nations that were yet to break free from their colonial masters. Alas, that dream did not materialize, as just 5 years and 3 months after independence, Nigeria's first republic, led by Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa, fell on January 15, 1966. You can check out the full story in our next episode.